and welcome to our great International Education and Schools Fair. And I'm delighted to introduce you to this webinar today, which is Raising Global Teens with Dr Anisha Abraham. So without further ado, I will introduce you to Jayne Constantinis, who's going to talk to Anisha today.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Good afternoon and welcome to the month-long fair programme of events, activities and content to help you navigate the currently rather challenging landscape of education and relocation. I'm delighted to be here with you for this hour, and we'd love to hear from you as we go through the conversation. So if you've got a question or a comment to make, then please use the chat box. We'll get through as many of your comments as we can. As Fiona said, we are delighted today that we've got Dr Anisha Abraham with us. She is a renowned pediatrician, adolescent health specialist, 25 years of global experience. She's lived in Boston, Washington and Amsterdam and Asia, so she definitely understands from first-hand experience the challenges of moving from place to place with a family. And she's the author of this recently released book, Raising Global Teens. Anisha, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Paul Williamson, executive coach, learning and development practitioner, and the father of teenagers himself. As is Marianne Curphey. She's a financial journalist and writer for Relocate Global, and she's an expert in work-life balance. She's also the mother of 2 teenage girls. Fiona, of course, who many of you know, is the managing editor of Relocate magazine and Relocate Global and Think Global People, and she's an expert in global mobility and international workforce management. And I will declare an interest in that I also have a 15-year-old daughter. So raising global teens is a topic that we're all passionately interested about. Anisha, I wonder if you can start by telling us about the inspiration behind this book and why you chose to write it now.
Well, I'll just say that more and more our world is becoming global, it's becoming mobilized, and we have more young people that are identifying as having parents who maybe are immigrants, they are immigrants themselves, they have moved from community to community or country to country, they have parents from different backgrounds, they're exposed to more than one culture on a daily basis. So I've written a book based on all the hot topics that young people are being exposed to right now, but also in that lens of this cross-cultural, multicultural world that we're living in.
And to what extent is the experience of these teenagers that you're describing different to the experience of teenagers for the last 2,000 years? I mean, it's never been an easy period of life, has it?
Well, I think that it's important to know that adolescence is a period of questioning and over time coming to resolution of one's unique identity, whether that's your physical identity, your gender and sexual identity, but also increasingly your cultural identity. And so being aware of that and being able to have conversations about these things are really important as, again, young people are becoming and identifying as being more cross-cultural and multicultural.
Is that what you mean then? Is that what the term third culture kid means? Some people may never have heard that expression. Can you explain what it means?
Yes, third culture certainly refers to a young person that may have a family, for example, to another country, and then is now navigating between the country of their parents' homeland, the new country, or the new community, and having that interstitial or third culture. And I'll just say that the term cross-cultural is even broader. So it encompasses young people that are third culture, but also people that have had a variety of experiences, as I've mentioned, in terms of even moving from community to community or having parents from different backgrounds. And I'll also add that more and more, it's not just about physical exposure to culture, but also virtually. So many of our young people are now on screens and they're being exposed to other cultures on a regular basis. So being aware of that, I think, is also part of this new movement towards being cross-cultural.
And of course, you're speaking from experience. What was your childhood experience like?
Well, I speak about this quite often in the book, but I was a daughter of South Asian immigrants to the United States. And when I grew up, there weren't many other young people that looked like me. So certainly, even when we were driving around, we saw someone else that was also, Indian, we would stop the car and get out and say hello. Of course, that's changed, but that was my experience growing up. Of certainly not, again, having other young people that looked or identified in the same way. And then as I went on and did my, work in as a physician, I also worked in different communities. I was a military physician, certainly worked in communities where young people were moving quite frequently from place to place. Certainly worked also among immigrant communities where there was a lot of change and transition that was occurring. And then about 10 years ago, our life also became global in that we moved from Washington, D.C. to initially Hong Kong and then to the Amsterdam, Netherlands. And now we're back again in Washington, D.C. So certainly I've had that experience as being a parent, but also as a physician in different communities taking care of young people.
And so we're obviously going to talk in some detail about the key issues, and you've already mentioned social media. We will touch on that in a second. But what do you think, give us the headlines, what do you think are the key challenges and also opportunities for these global teens?
Well, I think there's certainly some challenges that young people may be aware of or need to know about when they are global teens. Some of those challenges include a sense of grief and loss if you are moving from place to place. For example, my own boys just moved in the last 6 weeks from Europe back to the United States. And there's this tremendous sense of missing those connections, missing that community, missing that school community that they were part of before they moved. So grief and loss can be one piece of that. Certainly the other one that's a big issue is one related to identity and belonging. And that's one that comes up quite often. When I have all of these different cultures, who is my community? Who is my tribe? Where do I really belong? Who do I connect with? Those are also big issues that sometimes young people have. Now, on the positive side, and one that I think is so important, particularly in this atmosphere currently of, challenge and uncertainty, is the fact that young people that are cross-cultural have tremendous strengths when it comes to adaptability, cultural tolerance, of worldview, languages. These are all wonderful strengths that they bring to the table, and even resilience, which we can talk more about. But these are really important concepts as, again, we talk about what the world is experiencing right now that we need to come back to.
So I wonder if we might, the book is very broad, obviously, but let's just talk about the pandemic and what everybody is going through. What do you think is the particular impact on teens and global teens?
Well, what we do know, and certainly my experience in a number of communities right now, is that young people are feeling uncertain about the future. They're feeling anxious. They're feeling isolated from their peers and their family members. They're feeling a loss of that routine and structure that they may have had in place. If they're in online schools or experiencing lockdowns and not able to go back to the usual activities that they could have been doing. So I think there's a tremendous sense of that. And what we do know among adults is that there's been an increase in depression. There's been an increase in anxiety. And certainly that's also pervasive among young people. And I see that on a daily basis in my clinical practice. The young people are also now saying that they're feeling stressed and anxious and depressed. And I think these are really important things to be aware of. Now, I'll just say there's not only a kind of mental component to it, but also a physical one. And what we also know is that more young people are just not getting out and being physically active for a variety of reasons. And so we also are worried about the increase in things like obesity and the increase in the use of screen time and not having breaks. So there's a lot that we need to think about. And what I worry about is, are we creating this generation of young people that are going to be stunted both emotionally and physically? And that's why it's so important right now to have those conversations and connect to make sure we provide support.
Marianne and Paul, I wonder if you'd give us your perspective on your teenagers and what you are observing about them or what they're telling you about their experience of this pandemic.
What I've found amongst both my girls, they're 13 and 16, is that they desperately miss their friends and that they miss school. And I never thought I'd hear them say that. But they're desperate to go back to school. They're really keen for school to stay open. And they value the connections with other people who are going through the same thing as them. It's not that they don't want to spend time with other wider members of the family, but just that there is something in those peer groups that's really important. for young people, and we as parents can't provide that sense of belonging that they get from being in a group of teenagers who are the same age as them.
Yeah, I'd certainly echo that. I think that sense of being connected and kind of losing that. And I think certainly in lockdown and when we're all it feels like the world has contracted and we're in much smaller spaces now. And I think remembering that children need space alone, but equally they also need to be encouraged to spend time together with the family. So it's those important things that can slip away, like making sure that we all sit together for family meals, and I guess not getting lazy in our communication. That's what I've been noticing. Rather than asking the same stock questions at dinner time, like "How was your day?" It was all right.
Yeah.
Beyond that, because those are the kind of conversations I remember with my father. How was your day, Paul? Yeah, it was all right. Yeah. Move on, actually. Yeah. And as a coach, I guess sometimes I have to remind myself to use some of those, much more open questions and get a conversation going so that we can feel properly connected as a family. Because this does take work as a parent, doesn't it? And that's what's really coming out for me. And I've read Anisha's book. I'm halfway through it, actually, and it's already encouraged me to make some wonderful conversations and proactively do something about that. So I would recommend people read the book because there's some great tips and stuff. And I've already had 3 wonderful conversations with my 15-year-old son.
Yeah. I mean, that question in lockdown, how was your day? The answer is, well, you saw what I was doing because I was here all day again. So Anisha, from all of your wealth of experience and research, what can we as parents, and I was very interested that you referred there to the fact that many adults are also suffering, but we still have to be the parents, we're the grown-ups. What can we do to support our teens during these difficult times so that the rather depressing scenario of them being stunted emotionally and physically doesn't come to fruition?
Well, I have a few suggestions, and I think probably the most important one is, again, coming back to this point that Paul just made, which is having conversations right now, because conversations, again, create connections, and connections are so protective right now for young people and all of the other issues that they're dealing with. So taking time to have those conversations, we'll talk later about what's the best way to do that, but taking time to have that, to validate their emotions, to understand where they're coming from is really important. The other quick tips are coming back to having routines and rituals that provides a sense of stability for young people that may not have those routines and rituals in place. This is also applies to young people that may have gone off to university or may have had a job and are now back at home. Still having some sense of routines and rituals in place are really important. The other thing that I would also remind people is to know that we have very high expectations sometimes of our kids, and just realizing that this may be a time just to bring down those expectations a notch, because it may be harder for kids to perhaps perform online or to do the things that they wanted to in the same way. And I've certainly experienced that in my own household. One child doesn't really like online learning and is really having a lot of difficulty in terms of staying engaged. So being aware of those expectations that you're placing on your kids. Other quick thoughts, it's really important for us to be thinking about self-help or self-care right now. And as we talk about on planes as adults, we should be putting on our own oxygen mask before we help our kids. And so I talk a lot about what I say is the anti-stress toolkit, having a box or a kind of virtual box where we put in different things that are going to help ourselves as adults, and modeling that, but ensuring our kids also have things that they can do to make sure that they don't feel stressed, and using that early on. So whether that's, getting outdoors and, kicking a ball, it's, doing some mindfulness, it is, talking to a friend, building that into their lives. And the last piece I'll just say has to do with technology, because I get asked a lot about what's the right amount of screen time, and perhaps we'll talk about this more. But I'll just say that technology right now is also a powerful way for young people to stay connected. So being aware of that and knowing that the power of that and allowing those connections again to occur in different ways is really important.
I think your point about slightly lowering expectations is really interesting. Paul, you work with adults, don't you? You coach adults. And you presumably come across the negative outcomes of perhaps parents, making a few mistakes along the way.
Well, I do, and I do a lot of work both in kind of learning development and in one-to-one coaching with people around their kind of inner critic, which of course those kind of narratives get laid down really early on in our lives, in childhood and certainly through teenage years. So I'm very conscious of that now as a parent, that sometimes when we're not self-monitoring, we might say quite harsh things to our kids through frustration, and perhaps we're not as well behaved as we sometimes are in a work context. I've certainly noticed that in myself sometimes, and I guess it's that working on the kind of language that we use to make sure. I mean, the number of times I've heard people more or less who've been given a challenge of giving a presentation, for example, suddenly come out with these things like, well, I can't do it. I'm not a public speaker, and narratives about, I'm lazy and all those kinds of things, which of course parents sometimes say to their children through frustration, don't we? So I think there's something around compassion, isn't there? And I think there's something about self-compassion as well. So sometimes we will fall into that, not so great language and territory, but it's also to kind of confess that, and we can make that right. We can use that as a conversation. Said, I've reflected on what I said to you earlier. I really regret it because it comes from this place. It comes from a place where I want to keep you safe or whatever.
I must say that the huge thing that I've learned as a parent is to apologize. To actually say, I am really sorry that I did that or said that. And I have found that to work incredibly well as a way of breaking down barriers. Anisha, I wonder this idea of parents' aspirations. How best to deal with that, to manage it, and how best can children cope with it?
I think it's a really good question. And I think we have lots of aspirations for ourselves, much less our kids. And I just want to come back to this concept that all people are uneven, which means we excel in some areas and we have challenges in others. And being aware of that is so important when we talk about our own teenagers and our own children. And so I, as a pediatrician, spend a lot of time talking to young people about what is it that's their strength. What is it that they do well in, and how we can help build that? Because I think that's so important in terms of developing self-esteem and confidence. And of course, reminding them of when they do things right. Again, and not always just talking about when they do something wrong. But coming back to your question about aspirations, I think it's important to have goals and ideas, but I also think it's important to be aware of where there might be personal strengths and building those up. And certainly doing some time where you're maybe brainstorming goal setting with your own kids to figure out what is their aspirations and how you can bring them together. Because at the end of the day, you want the motivation to be intrinsic and not extrinsic. And that's sometimes where issues related to resentment and frustration can occur.
Yeah, it's quite a moment, isn't it, as a parent, when you fully accept that they are an individual and they're not a mini version of you. Let them be what they're going to be. Let's think for a moment, if we may, about international children and many who are going to be, perhaps not right now because of the pandemic, but later on, having to say goodbye, moving to new territories, new friendship groups, and so on. And of course, you, Anisha, have experienced this yourself. Give us your thoughts on how best to help them through those periods.
I think this is a very important question. Again, one that many young people may potentially experience within the community right now that we're talking about. And again, really preparing them to take the time to say goodbye is important, because sometimes, as I mentioned, these issues in terms of unresolved, loss and grief can really be an issue. I can just say in my own international moves as an adult, it took me 2 years to get over each country that I'd moved to next, because I felt a profound sense of loss of the last community and the last connections and the last kind of support group that I had. So just thinking about that, and now thinking about young people and being aware of that, making sure, again, that they have the time to say goodbye to the folks that are important to them, continuing those connections when they move to the next place, whether, again, it's making sure that they're still staying connected by phone calls or in other ways, but also starting to make sure that they get integrated into that new community, whether that's taking part in extracurricular activities, it's taking part in support groups, it's finding that tribe that really can be meaningful to them. But those are all ways to ensure that that transition goes smoothly.
Fiona, you've got years and years of experience of observing and helping people through these transitional phases. What have you observed works well in terms of helping the children to settle?
Well, I think it is first from an employer and the global mobility people who are supporting them to realise that this is a family, and there are individuals, the employee, the partner and the children are all in that together. But it is true now that companies are viewing much more the talent they're moving and the whole family as being really important. And there's this huge work that's being done on transition and change, and that's filtering through. And I know, Anisha, you belong to a group that explores that. So I think it's all with this rise of engagement as well, engaging with the employees and employee parents to recognise what's been happening, particularly in the COVID experience, and what they can do to make things better. And of course, there's a whole range of people who've got expertise in this area, but the start is acknowledging that people are at the heart of businesses, but also of the move.
Anisha, is there ever a sense that children are being transplanted from one area to another and it wasn't their choice because it's the adults making the decisions?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think that's a situation where you want to try to avoid in some ways. I think even in our own family, we've tried to be somewhat upfront when we do know that we have that decision of bringing it up to our own kids and saying, we have this transition that's coming up. We really want you to understand, what's happening here, for you to know that we're going to miss the community that we're part of right now, but how do we start to build those connections in the next place? And kids are actually quite creative and quite resourceful, and in many ways quite resilient. I remember my own boys right away looking on Google Maps to see where our house was, where their school was, what the commute was going to be like. And so they start to kind of think about that next place. So being able to support them, being able to involve them as early on in that process, giving them, again, some ability to have some sense of answers for some of the questions that they may have, creating connections with young people or families in the new place are all good ways to help with that change and transition.
And what are the particular challenges when children are going to boarding school and leaving behind in their home country, if you like, friends and family and their support network?
Well, I think some of the same issues apply for boarding school as it would be if you're making a move or if you're going off to university, which is you're losing that community, that structure that you have, and in some place, and also using that family support that you've had. So being aware of those issues, making sure that you have that support when you go off to the next environment is really important. And I'll also just bring up that sometimes young people are struggling with issues before they leave the home, whether that's related to depression or body image or other issues. So making sure that you're aware of that, you're getting support for them, you're ensuring that there's support in that next community is really important, because the times where I've seen challenge occur is when those issues really come up and they don't have that infrastructure in place to take care of it. So being aware of that, and again, that's where conversations and connections are important, and ensuring young people get the support and the help they need, and sometimes that means professional help, is really important in terms of ensuring that they're successful as they go off to an environment like boarding school.
Marianne, tell us about the conversation you had with your teenage girls about relocating to another country.
When I knew that I was taking part in this webinar, I canvassed them and asked them what I thought would be really important. And their feedback was really specific. And they said, we feel leaving our friends and trying to integrate into a new group of friends would be the biggest challenge, and that it would be helpful to a new school, particularly a new boarding school, if the staff facilitated and helped those kind of initial connections and friendships rather than just leaving it to chance. And the other point that they made was that having a trusted adult in that new environment, whether it's a teacher or a matron or someone that they could speak to who was trustworthy and sympathetic and could validate their feelings and help them talk through some of those issues, who was outside the family but who was trusted, would be a really important part of that integration and the moving process and starting a new life somewhere else.
Would you agree with that, Anisha? Are these trusted adults who aren't parents, are they an important role? Do they fulfill an important role in a teenager's life?
Absolutely. I am such a firm believer in what I call the global village, and realizing that we as parents can't do this alone. And sometimes our own kids don't want to listen to us, and they create connections, and we need to embrace those connections with other coaches, mentors, other adults. And I'll just say, as an example, even in my own family, one son was okay with the move and seemed to embrace our move. The other is still angry with us about having that transition and change, and is still really holding on, to his time in the Netherlands. And my own mother, his grandmother, has been really important in terms of being able to be someone that he can talk to the point where I sometimes just pick up the phone and put her on video call and say, you need to talk to him right now. We're going through a tough period. So coming back to this concept that you've just brought up, which is we do really need to ensure that young people have a group of people that they can relate to, that connect to, that they can talk to when they're going through difficulty, and understanding it may be more than just us, but that global village is so important as they're experiencing change and transition.
The problem, of course, with teenagers and trying to facilitate them making new friends,
Right.
you tend to do that when they're young. You go, there's
Right.
another 5-year-old, go
Right.
and be friends with them.
It's much harder to do. And I will say you can't make play dates for your teenager the way that you can for a younger child. And as a result, you're really leaving it up sometimes to their resourcefulness, which they may, again, not be able to navigate. What I do recommend is encouraging them to join extracurricular activities where they're allowed to connect with other young people that also have similar interests, as one way to provide those friendships. And again, just as an example, one of my sons is now a debate team, and that's been a fabulous way for him to connect with other young people and also, again, build on that strength. That's something that he really enjoys. So using that as an opportunity, I think, is important.
Yeah. Now, already we've talked about connectivity and the importance of community and so on. And when people are physically separated, that inevitably is going to happen via a screen. I know that you've got a lot in the book about screen time, technology generally, and social media. Give us your headline thoughts on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, that's a loaded question. And I will say that screen time is a really difficult concept for many of us as parents, because we just didn't grow up with this. We certainly have good ideas when it comes to sleep and nutrition, but again, coming to devices, it's a lot more challenging for us to give good boundaries or get good advice, because again, these were things that we didn't really have to navigate when we were, again, at this age. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of benefit to having screens and devices. As I mentioned, there's tremendous educational value. It's very important in terms of connections. Sometimes it's that social currency that kids really need, but there can be a downside. And I certainly, for example, have young people that are on Instagram and social media quite frequently. And what we do know is if you happen to have a child who constantly is checking how many likes they have and is really worried about what I call this comparison and always comparing themselves to others, they're actually 2 times higher at risk for issues related to body image. So understanding your child, knowing if they're kind of also having some challenges related to media use. If, again, they're a child that's constantly on it, that's their only means of getting, satisfaction and, being able to connect in the world, that's a young person that probably needs a lot more what I call non-digital time and breaks and being able to do other things.
And of course, the challenge within a family is often that you might have one child who fits into that category and another child who doesn't. So how do you set the boundaries and the rules?
It's difficult, but I do think, again, you need to know your own children and realize that some are going to be able to handle those boundaries really well, and others are going to have more challenges because of their own ability with impulse control. Some kids also have attention deficit or other issues, which also can really affect their ability to rein in those impulses. So being aware of that and making sure that they potentially get a little bit more support in a way that still seems, democratic in the family and that everyone can understand is important. But constantly having those conversations, checking in, and not being afraid to go outside of the family if you feel like you're not able to kind of navigate that and get extra help.
Paul and Marianne, how are you getting on with the whole world of screen time generally and social media in particular? What are your boundaries in your families? Marianne, what about you?
I found in lockdown it's been the main way that my daughters have kept in touch with their friends. So they've actually found it really helpful to have conversations and FaceTime and messages with their friends. So I do try to encourage them to leave the screen alone as we get towards bedtime. But I haven't imposed specific boundaries because it's been really important to them. And I think I've also had a lot of very open conversations about the use of social media and appropriate language and behaviour on social media. And I think that they've developed some skills there on how to handle it themselves. And I trust them to do that competently as well.
What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge, isn't it? I think my youngest son spends a lot of time. Again, like Marianne said, it's important that he's connecting with his friends and his social network. I think what's also played into this as well, though, is a bit about how young people look. Of course, going through puberty. I mean, my son is 6'5" at 15, so he is tall, wow. Big. I think what was useful actually reading Anisha's book is that idea. Well, actually, he might look like an adult, but he's not in terms of his brain development and stuff like that. So that was really helpful. But I think going back to the screen time and things like that, I did notice that he was very unhappy with the way he looked. Fortunately, he took that to the next stage of really getting interested in nutrition, eating well, and he started exercising and doing weight training and things like that. And he's lost a tremendous amount of weight and look, and feels the best that he's ever felt over lockdown, actually. So that was a great example, I think, of how sometimes there's a negative side to this, isn't it? But certainly for him, it's been a confidence boosting thing. But it's one to navigate very carefully as a parent, because equally, even that can go too far where, you're not eating enough or over exercising and things like that. So it does require you as a parent, I think, to keep talking about it, kind of feed the great stuff that happens, but, raise those questions here and there and do it in a gentle, kind and caring way, so that you're getting a much better conversations about all of this stuff.
And Paul, you did confess to me earlier that you've got a lockdown paunch. We can't see it now, so perhaps you can get your son to take you out for a workout.
There you go.
Thanks from my team.
Anisha,
can I just ask a question? Someone got into us with a question about the science. We referred to it, but are you able to just briefly give us an overview about the neurology, the teen brain side of it?
Absolutely. I believe that Paul was referring to, again, what happens in the teen brain. I think it's really important as parents and as adults just to understand that the teen brain continues to develop until you're in your mid-20s. So even though you have a child that maybe at 15 is, a certain height and looks fully adult, or even at 18 is going off to perhaps school or, doing other very adult things, but they're still developing when it comes to their brain. And there's still going to be some times where they may be making decisions that you wonder, where was that based? What I think is important to understand is that the prefrontal cortex, which is the area right here in the front of the brain, is a command center. That's where organization and logical thought and thinking about consequences comes from. And those connections are not completely made, again, as I mentioned, until sometime in the late 20s. So there's going to be some times where they still might be doing other behaviors. The limbic system, which has to do with pleasure and reward, is much stronger during adolescence until the end of that full brain development, which means that a lot of young people are going to be trying and testing and experimenting. And I actually tell them that trying and doing these things is a really normal part of what happens when your brain is in that work in progress. It's trying and testing and sometimes making mistakes, but also realizing that you only have one brain and trying to protect it. And that's what we as adults are trying to do, is try to protect them in terms of sometimes that impulsive behavior and sorting and supporting them in terms of making good decisions. So what do I mean by that? Starting alcohol use or starting cigarettes early has a much higher impact on a teenager than it would be an adult, because you're more likely to become addicted if you start smoking at age 14 and 15 than if you did if you were in your 20s. So a lot of times I say, how can we just delay these behaviors just to a little bit later? And then the final point as we talk about screen time and other things is that, again, there's a lot of impulsive behavior that's happening. So conversations that we should be having with our kids are, what do you think about things like sexting? Or, when someone texts or sends you a picture, how are you going to handle that? Because, again, there's a lot of impulsive behavior that kids have in terms of responding to something right away. So I always really recommend, can we just stop and wait for a moment? Let's not respond right away and think about what those consequences will be. So hopefully that frames a little bit about what to think about, that kids, again, are in many ways trying things out and testing. That's a normal part of adolescence. But again, because of that, sometimes they may also get into danger. And so helping them to make decisions and think about these things are important.
So what would your specific advice be around alcohol and when it's right to allow it and in fact, even to introduce it to your children?
That is a really loaded question because there's so many cultural values around this. And I can certainly say, having a husband that's German and growing up in an Indian American household, we still have very different cultural values about alcohol and alcohol in the family. But having said that, coming back to the science and the research, I would say that what we do know is having high use of alcohol, what we call binge drinking, 5 or more servings of alcohol in a short period of time, can have very small changes on the brain that are irreversible. So even one episode of binge drinking, you can see on the basis of a magnetic resonance imaging MRI scan. And so if you have many of those episodes, again, they're causing small little changes that can affect brain and brain cognition. So as much as we can try to delay some of these behaviors, getting them to make good decisions, getting them to think about what happens if you're drinking a lot with consent and other issues are really important, but also realizing that there's very different cultural values in communities about this and what your morals are, what you as a family think, and how to handle peer pressure are other important conversations to have at home.
And that, of course, for families who are moving from country to country and perhaps where you've got parents of different nationalities, that's where it becomes very complex.
Absolutely.
And the age at which I'm very interested in this because my daughter turns 16 in 2 weeks' time, and I'm going to let her have a sip of champagne on that day. What age is alcohol less damaging to the brain? I mean, as you've described it, technically less damaging.
Well, I think coming back to your question, having your daughter sip a glass of champagne with you as a family, being together, talking about that is very different than a young person that goes off and is drinking it on their own because they, again, are testing, they're experimenting, they are not happy with themselves. So, creating that stage in late adolescence or sometime, through your 20s is when you'd want to delay.
Okay, we lost you for a moment there, Anisha. I'm sorry about that. In the somewhere in the technological haze. I wonder if we can go back to body image, something that Paul drew attention to with his son. And again, I think we as parents feel that we are treading on eggshells, that anything we say might be potentially damaging. Help us navigate through that, if you will.
No, I think body image is a really difficult issue. And again, so many young people are developing their sense of their own body and how they feel about that during the adolescent period. And so a lot of the focus really is on how we can make them feel good about themselves, and in some ways turning the focus from what's on the outside to what's on the inside. So that's where I talk a lot about strengths and building on strengths and their unique strengths, as opposed to just focusing on their physique, which is a lot of what, again, they're getting from social media, and they're getting from their peer group, and they're getting from what they're seeing in advertisements. An important question that I ask young people when I see them in clinical settings is, when you look at yourself in the mirror, what do you see, and are you happy with that? And I get a huge range of responses, like, Dr. Abraham, I have a big nose, but everyone else has a big nose in my family. I'm okay. But then I also have young people that say, Dr. Abraham, I'm really unhappy with what I see. I think I'm really fat, or I think I'm really ugly, or I think I need to lose, 15 kgs or whatever it is. And so for a young person that's on a regular basis not feeling good about themselves, that is a young person that really needs support early on, because it can, again, really affect self-esteem. So I guess my first point is be aware of how young people are feeling about their bodies. Check in, as Paul did very nicely. He was also checking in to make sure that weren't other issues in terms of body image with his son when he started exercising a lot. Of course, we want to be careful with messaging we give our kids, because certainly we as parents, whatever we're feeling about our own bodies can also affect how kids feel about theirs. So being very thoughtful when you're making comments like, I need to start a diet now, or I think I'm really fat, those things also trickle down to our kids. So being aware of that, and trying to not say too much, if anything, in terms of, what you're seeing, as they're kind of transforming during adolescence may be important. But also considering getting some extra help in terms of a third party coming in, whether that's a coach, a psychologist, a professional. If you're worried, you think they're struggling, they may not be healthy in some of these behaviors, and doing that early is probably my biggest recommendation.
And of course, it's boys and girls equally, yes, isn't it, these days? I think it always was the perception that it was only girls who had problems in this area.
You're correct in saying that it's not just a girl issue. It certainly also can include boys. And in my own practice, I've had young boys that have come in with body image issues, with anorexia, sometimes with bulimia, certainly, of course, also over-exercising, using steroids, using supplements to kind of build up weight. So I think there's a lot of unhealthy behaviors that can occur regardless of one's gender, but just being aware about talking about it specifically, also talking about what their friends are doing as a way to understand what they're doing. Because if their friends are worried about their bodies, are dieting, are restricting, or having any of those issues, that of course affects young people as well.
Yeah. What are the signs that we as parents should be looking out for? I mean, you've described all sorts of interesting and normal adolescent behaviours, but how can we spot that something isn't normal?
I think it really depends on the issue, but if we're talking about mental health, for example, which is a big concern right now, just realizing that if there's a big change from previous could be a tip-off that there's something wrong, but also to realize that it's difficult, and all of you are parents, and you realize that sometimes young people aren't going to be really open about their feelings, or they're one moment they're really happy and the next moment they're not, and there's a lot of lability in terms of emotions. But extreme irritability, being really prickly, really not feeling very down on a regular basis, any changes in sleeping or eating, not connecting with the friend group in the same way, those are little signs that there may be something that's off. And again, that's an important time for you to get in and check in and see how their friends are doing, then how they're doing, to understand what might be occurring. The other tip I have for this is that many times as adults, we're afraid to ask specifically about mental health. For example, we're afraid to say, have you thought about hurting yourself? Because we think we're more likely to increase the chance of them actually being suicidal. And the converse is true. By asking very specific questions, we're more likely to get young people the support that they need. So I think it's really important, again, to be talking about these issues and being aware of any subtle signs. You know your child probably better than anyone else.
I think that's what you've just said there is really interesting, because I immediately think I wouldn't dare refer to that because I feel I'm not qualified to handle that conversation appropriately. Marianne, would you feel comfortable having that conversation with one of your daughters if you felt something was off?
I think that Anisha's tip about asking about their friends is a really, really good one, because I think it's quite a non-judgmental and gentle way into a conversation about the culture of the school or the friendship group and how the behavior of the people might be influencing them or how they might be affected. So I suppose the question that I would have for Anisha is, if you have that conversation and that answer comes up, then what do you do?
Where you have a young person that says that their friends may be suicidal or depressed? Yeah. Is that the question? I think I'd be very concerned for your own child if there's a friend that's suicidal or depressed, because what studies have shown is that they were more at risk themselves. And so I think the first response is, well, how can we support them? You know, this is very important information, and to keep it to yourself, because many times teenagers are afraid of breaking their friends' trust and talking about these issues, but telling them it's so important that their friend get help and that they are encouraged to talk to an adult person to get the support before something happens is one piece of that, but certainly also then really checking in on what's happening with them. And a couple other tips that may help in terms of conversations, because I'm asked this quite often by parents. In addition to asking about peer group, I recommend trying to do things where you're not looking directly in their eyes. And if you think about when you were a teenager yourself and your parents are looking at your eyes, it's very intimidating. So if you can do an activity in parallel, so whether that's walking or driving or biking, or sometimes with my own kids where it's late at night and it's dark in their rooms and I come in and that's where I get the best bits of information because, you know, there's no one really looking, it's dark. Those are ideas in terms of getting more information from your kids.
The other issue that springs to my mind is when your child is part of a friendship group and you know the parents of their friends. That can often be a really useful resource, can't it? Checking in with those parents and finding out what's going on within the group. And very often you'll find out what's going on with your child. But for people who are relocating, for international families who are moving around a lot, that often is a piece of the jigsaw that's missing, isn't it?
That is a really difficult issue. And I can certainly say that for people that are staying in one community, you have that community to come back to, and there's some stability in that. There's some anchors in that. And for people that are moving from place to place, you're using those anchors, you're losing that stability in some ways. So being resourceful, making sure that you're putting down roots, making sure that you're creating those new communities is really important. And I think certainly as a parent and as an expat, when I've moved from place to place, the first thing that I did was to make sure I joined, the school organization. I put myself onto listservs where I could understand what was going on. I made, friendships with neighbors and others just to understand what is happening in this community. How can I make sure I know what's happening with their peer group? So I really encourage parents that are having those experiences to make sure that they're creating those roots and joining those groups to get information. It can be otherwise very bewildering when you're by yourself.
And I can really reinforce that the quality of care in a lot of schools and the communities, they put a lot of effort in, and they see their community not only being the child and the child at school, but the wider parental community. And there have been some very heartwarming stories about what people have done during the lockdown and COVID to really welcome in and support the parent community as well. So I think on the majority of parents should feel really reassured by just how supportive everybody is.
Fiona, the other day we were hearing, weren't we, that one international school, I can't remember which one it is, has a cafe on site for the parents. Rather than hanging around at the school gate, as I've always had to do, there's a lovely cafe to foster that sort of sense of community.
Yes, and another school where they recognise that many different languages are spoken and families come from multilingual backgrounds and may speak, 5 languages, and how they can support not only the children to keep up their native language, but the whole family, and are actively running workshops and informal sort of coffee and chat over how they can help their children through different ages and stages to keep up their native languages and be able to communicate with grandparents and family back home or within the extended family.
And that...
I'm sorry, I was just going to add, I think international schools really do this well because they understand that young people are moving from place to place, and they understand that there's a lot of transition and challenge. So most schools really have in place supports not only for young people, but also for parents. And I can just say from my own experience in Amsterdam, our son's international school also offered what was called Let's Talk for the parents. And that's how I learned Dutch, was from another parent that spoke Dutch, and a number of us that were coming from other countries felt that was a really important way for us to even get to the grocery store, understand some very basic things. So it is really a strength, I think, when you are looking at the international school environment in terms of what they offer, and being able to use that can be very helpful for the entire family and for transition.
And what Fiona mentioned there about keeping up your native language, it's also part of what you referred to, Anisha, at the beginning, which is your tribe. Where do I belong? So keeping up your native language would be part of that, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. So again, encouraging your own kids, but certainly your family, to also find those connections within your own community is really important. So certainly for my own boys, finding a German community, being able to keep up the German language, getting some support with that was really an important part of our moves in various communities.
Fiona, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No,
you
that's right. Well, two things sprung to mind. One, we'll perhaps bring Paul in here, having read about, he was very taken by the snowplow and the dolphin approach that you mentioned, and shared that with us when we were talking. So that will be one thing. But the other thing that schools do really well is say hello, but also say goodbye. And then also just touching on the COVID situation, because people are going through anxiety, and children and young people. But I mean, not only goodbye when you're leaving, but sadly, if a relative or friend had unfortunately died, and that could be more the case with the COVID situation, a grandparent or whatever, perhaps you can just go into that, because I think there could be some practical tips for people who have had a bereavement or that sort of situation.
So your question is, how do we best support young people that have had a loss in the family? Yes. I think the most important thing is, again, coming back to ensuring that they're doing okay, validating those emotions, understanding, the extent of that loss, making sure that they are able to really understand, what it is that person represented to them, and some of the beautiful things that may be part of it, and how they can hold on to it is another piece of that. And many communities now are offering counseling support, even virtually. And so tapping into that if a young person is really struggling with it. I can again say, just from my time in Europe, a number of young people I knew had elderly relatives that had either died of COVID or had other people that they knew. So there was a tremendous sense of loss, even among young people, in terms of what might be happening around them. So being aware of that, talking about it, making sure they're getting support is really important.
The word communication has come up, I think, in every topic that we've discussed so far. Is it the most important thing as the parent of a teenager?
Well, I think it's a very important part of helping young people to navigate adolescence, is being, again, able to create this atmosphere of openness, an atmosphere where young people can come back, and knowing that you don't have to have conversations about everything, but at least planting the seed for them to know that they can come back and talk about an issue, whether, again, it's mental health or sexual health, or something else that's out there that they're navigating and they have questions about. So that, I think, is communication, the creating an atmosphere, a place where that they can come back and know that they can talk about issues and get support.
Fiona asked you to tell us about the snowplow parenting.
Well, the snowplow parent refers to a parent that removes obstacles like a snowplow would. And of course, there are many cultures where parents sometimes are really trying to, of course, support their kids to the point where sometimes they take over and really want to make sure things are easy for their child to allow them to succeed. And what I talk a lot about is that the biggest predictor in success sometimes for a young person is really not just about perfect grades or getting into the top university or having the top job, but it's the ability to get back up on your feet and what I call get bounce, to handle challenges and to handle failure. And when you have a young child whose parents are removing those obstacles, are making it easy, they're, ensuring that when they leave their backpack at home, for example, that they bring that in, or, they're contacting the teacher right away to make sure that, things are better with their grades, or doing things where they're not allowing the child necessarily to may be the first person to navigate it. They are creating an atmosphere where that child is not able to do problem solving on their own. And when they finally do go off, and this is what I've seen when I work with young adults, and they have that first challenge, a bad grade, a breakup in a relationship, they fall apart. And so allowing kids to experience some of those challenges ahead of time at home where you're still in that environment, or getting them to start to problem solve if they're already not in your home, and getting them to be more autonomous and independent is really important. So I think that's the importance of not being a snowplow parent and being more of a dolphin parent, which allows, you're kind of going with the flow, you're allowing kids to, again, experience some of those challenges, and you're being supportive to them when there are issues that come up.
I've actually seen this come up with my daughter, actually, with particularly with her peer group around like that A-star, reaction. So, particularly with people that do very well and then want to maintain that standard. And it's interesting because I think this then shows up in adulthood and it shows up in organizations. You can certainly see people who are A-star, and they come into an organization where they want to know how to get an A-star. They want to know the kind of structure in order to succeed. And let's be honest, the real world and the organizational world, that's not very clear a lot of the time. So it can be a real struggle, I think, for young people who have had that kind of academic successful background to then enter into this, different world, I suppose. So I think that there is a responsibility on all of us as parents, but as caregivers, to children to prepare them for that kind of world, and to prepare them for the what's going to happen when you don't get that A-star. And actually, sometimes through those failures and where things haven't worked are the opportunities where we potentially learn so much more, that we can discover something about ourselves that is much more profound. So that kind of tendency to want to benignly protect our kids from that could be doing them a disservice. So I think it's a really, really important aspect to explore with our young people.
It's such a strong instinct, isn't it, to fix everything? Because from the moment you have that little bundle in your arms, you are responsible for shielding them from danger and protecting them. And so it's very difficult to step back from that, isn't it? But Anisha, you'd say that we should start doing that, quite early on, allowing them to solve problems, to build resilience.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. It's really difficult. And as a parent, I struggle with this myself. But I think what we do know is if we allow young people to become a little bit more autonomous and allow them to problem solve and become more independent, we are really, again, enabling them to become successful adults that can thrive. And when we, again, are protecting them from those challenges, we're actually doing them a disservice in the long run. So, again, being aware of that and thinking about how to build that in is so important.
And I think this... Sorry, carry on, Marianne.
I was going to say, I think that's a really important point to make, and also around friendships as well, because I think it can be difficult to see your child making friends or suffering in friendships and making mistakes in friendships. and wanting to kind of go in and fix it for them. And actually they do learn more by navigating those difficult periods of friendships, or moving from one friendship to a group to another, and figuring it out for themselves.
And of course, we're given a golden opportunity right now during these difficult times to put that into practice, because there are things we simply cannot fix. You know, I've mentioned my daughter's turning 16 in 2 weeks' time. I cannot deliver a party for her. I can't get her to have lunch in the lovely restaurant where we were going to go. I can't fix it. So she has got to learn to deal with that disappointment, as do I, and trying to model best practice, obviously.
Absolutely. I think that this time is a really good time for us to start to realize that our kids are experiencing disappointments or not having those milestones. And again, how we can start to build in those really important skills of how do you handle these challenges, and knowing that this, being able to handle it now, is going to really prepare you to be able to handle all those other challenges that are going to come your way as you become an adult.
I wonder if we're nearly out of time, sadly. I wish we could go on for the rest of the day. I wonder if I could ask you to give your final thought on not the most important, but one of the most important tools as a parent that we can use to help our children through these particularly difficult times, but in general, to help them become successful and happy global teens. And I'm going to start, obviously, with you, Anisha.
I think we've discussed quite a few of those tools, but will come back again to the importance of having those conversations and using that as a way to really check in with kids, validate their emotions, understand where they are right now, and certainly get additional support if you feel that they're in any way having challenges is really important. So taking that time, I would challenge anyone that's listening right now to make sure that they do take time today or within the week to talk to their teenager about what's going on and how they can build on something that's happening in their lives.
Thank you very much. Marianne, what about you?
Absolutely echo what Anisha said about communication and taking time to listen, and also maybe emphasizing the importance of downtime. I think our children are all encouraged to be overachievers, and actually there's nothing wrong with just kind of not doing something well and not necessarily being brilliant at everything, but just enjoying a bit of downtime and relaxing as well.
Paul?
It's interesting. I've been thinking about this recently in terms of, obviously, outside of parenting, I'm a coach. And it's interesting thinking about some of the things that are important to me about coaching. And one of those is around curiosity. And I think sometimes perhaps I haven't been applying that as much at home. You know, where perhaps, you know, you're more inclined to be more on the side of, you know, establishing rules and all that kind of thing, which is an important part of being a parent. But equally, being open-minded, you know, being non-judgmental and tolerant is also an important part of being a parent, I think. And I think bringing that into the forefront of my mind when I'm having conversations with my kids is really important, as well as, you know, bringing it back to kindness and compassion too. We can show, can't we, as parents? We love our kids, and showing that not just through our words but through our actions is really important. So that you know, we have to be modeling that for them to then show that in their own interactions with people, and that's what I'd always bring it back to.
And Fiona, you haven't got teenagers at the moment.
No, I've had teenagers, of course.
What have you learned along the way?
I've learned a lot along the way, and I can remember I walked around a field trying to bring up various topics, and the long trip there and back to school to bring up difficult conversations. But I think one of the things also that I touched on briefly was this thing about saying goodbye. And I know that's something that the school communities are also very important about, that you somehow give value to the place you're moving on with. And I know there are different tips about stories and sharing things. I wonder if you have a tip, because it's heartbreaking for everybody. But I know my own daughter, when she was young, she made a terrible fuss about leaving. We moved from Aberdeen, and she made a terrible fuss about it. But then she arrived at the new school perfectly happy. Whereas my son, who just took it in his stride while we were there, then when we got there, he was the one who found it more difficult. So I think that it is important to say goodbye to your Scottish friends or your French friends when you move country, and you know, what would you recommend is the best way to go about that?
I think we've talked a little bit about this, but I think it's so important, as you said, to make sure that there is a sense of formal goodbyes in one community. There's some sense of kind of resolution before you leave, and for, again, any young person to start to create connections in that next place, and just to realize that every young person is going to handle it differently. And some people are going to do very well with that change, and others aren't. And being aware of that in your own kids is so important. So thank you again for bringing that up. This whole idea of mobility, change, identity are huge themes with the young people that we're working with. So being aware of this, going back to their stories, providing those connections are really important tips and tools I think we can build in.
Well, you've given us some wonderful, very, very practical tools. Is the book doing well, and where can people find it?
The book is actually an Amazon bestseller in a few categories in the UK, in Germany, in the US, and people can find it in a variety of places, to include at amazon.uk.co and at Waterstones, and otherwise my website, dranishaAbraham.com.
Fantastic. We are very grateful that you've given us your time this afternoon. Thank you. Marianne, thank you to you as well. Paul, thank you to you. And of course, Fiona, I hope you have found that stimulating and useful. Thank you for joining us as well. A really brilliant end to the first week of this great International Education in Schools Fair. We've got some real highlights coming up as well. Next week, let me tell you about a couple of them. On Thursday, that's the 12th, Dr. Douglas Otter, who is a child psychologist and counsellor, written a book called Safe Passage. He's going to be talking more. We've touched on these issues already today about transition and mobility, and that word that has come up, belonging. So that's on Thursday the 12th. On Friday, we're going to be talking about single-sex versus co-ed schools and how to choose what is best for your child. And we've got Clarissa Farr with us for that. She's an expert on education and leadership and the ex-High Mistress of St. Paul's Girls' School. There is plenty of content online about the whole month of activities, so do go to the website. You can look back at some of the events that have already happened. There are great guides there, and you can choose what you're going to attend for next week. For now, though, wherever you are in the world, whatever the restrictions are, I hope you manage to have a very pleasant weekend. We'll see you again soon. Thank you for joining us. Bye for now.